Marcel, let's start off with, where did your passion for Ferrari come from?
Oh my goodness. As a child, like age 6, I was on vacation in the Italian-speaking part in Switzerland, and we were in a nice house, and every morning we saw the baker, the local baker, arriving with a black 250 GTE, bringing fresh bread.
Must have been expensive bread.
Yeah, that was okay. My father paid for that, I'm sure. But I will never forget that baker driving up the hill to the house with a black GTE. That was fun. So that's memorized.
How do you go from being a kid who spots the local baker on a holiday driving a Ferrari to becoming the Hercule Poirot of the Ferrari world?
Well, it's only about 50 years ago that this happened. It took a while. I fell in love with these cars. I like the history of these cars, as you know. I like to research these cars. I like to dig a lot to find out as much as I can, because each of these cars is individual, and each car has an individual history, and it's so fun. It's like a detective work.
Is there a particular period of Ferrari that you find more fascinating than others?
Well, clearly the 50s and the 60s are richer in history than the later years.
Why is that?
Because these cars are so rare and scarce, and many of the original owners are very famous people, VIPs, industrialists, movie guys. Each car was hand-built, not by robots as we are used today. And automatically, each car is really individual. I could almost say tailor-made.
Yes. Much more tailor-made than the program that they call tailor-made today, I presume.
It's a difference, yeah. There is a difference for sure.
When this car was made at the end of 56, I think, or
Yes.
beginning of 57?
56, yeah.
What type of business was Ferrari at the time?
Oh, it was still a very small company. They built only very, very few cars, like 100 cars per year. We must not forget, 57 was just about 12 years after World War II ended, and Italy was still badly hurt. Materials were very difficult to find, metal and all these things that you need to build cars. So I have to say Enzo Ferrari really must have been a very powerful person to bring it all together just a short time after the war ended.
Now, much of what you do is, can I say, automotive voodoo, shrouded in mystery to some degree. But let's say that, okay, you've come here today and we're looking at this car. What does an expert like you look for first? What's the first step in trying to peel back the layers of discovering a car like this?
Well, a car like this is quite rare because you don't see that many unrestored cars, especially nowadays. With prices increased so much in the last 30 years, it's normal that the majority of these cars has been restored and re-restored, etc. An original car can only be original once. If you start restoring it, the old feeling, the good stuff, how it was built is gone forever. So I always warn people, is it really okay to have the car restored? Of course, there is a sort of a red line or a moment in time when you must restore it because it's too late, but certainly not on this fantastic Boano.
Are you somebody who has changed their mind over the last decades that you've been doing what you do? In other words, let's say, had we been having this conversation 30 years ago, and that's about how long we've known each other, would you have been preaching that the car should be left original, or would you have been in the camp that said, make it perfect?
No, I always like the cars in the original configuration and in the original colors, especially nowadays because the majority of the cars in the meantime has been repainted resale red, which I absolutely hate. And we must not forget these cars, especially a car like this, in the 50s, most of the Ferraris were not red. They were in a green like this, or in a gray, or in a dark blue, or in a black. Only the real Ferrari racing cars, the competition cars, they were red, of course. But seeing a non-red Ferrari today gives me much more pleasure than any red Ferrari.
What sort of person would typically have bought a car like this when they were new? Because, as you say, the brand itself, World War II had only been over for barely a dozen years. The brand itself was making a very small number of cars. Not that many people, certainly not compared to today, had ever seen a Ferrari on the road or knew what it was. So what sort of person made that bold choice?
Well, there were a number of wealthy Italian and European industrialists that were able to afford these cars. We must not forget, when these cars were brand new, they cost like 5 to 7 million Italian lira, which basically was the price of a nice apartment. So it was not normal to buy a car like this. And also, when you were looking what was driving in the streets at the time, the majority was Cinquecentos, maybe an Alfa Romeo or a Lancia, but certainly not a Ferrari. So a Ferrari in those years was like a UFO, like a spaceship, something from a different planet. Very, very rare. Of course, there was not as much traffic as we have today, but yeah, it's like if you see a LaFerrari today in a normal traffic in the city of Geneva.
That's
still
what
like
this would have been like
in
the mid-50s.
Yes, yes.
And I don't suppose in those days anybody ever imagined that the cars would have one day gone up in value.
No, we should not forget that these cars were built as a tool to drive, as a daily driver, as a race car sometimes. Nobody expected these cars to last for 40, 50, 60 years. Fortunately, most of these cars have survived, and some of them in a very well-preserved condition. And yeah, like art or like watches or jewelry, it has become something very collectible. They are very rare. They don't exist in hundreds.
How many of this model do you think were made originally, if you had to
about 70
estimate?
units in total, in various configurations, of course. There were some alloy-bodied cars. There were some one-offs by special coach builders. But basically, a 250 Boano is nothing more than a 250 Tour de France, but with a different body. But what is underneath is more or less identical to a Tour de France.
The chassis length is the same?
Chassis length is 2600 millimeters, yes. It's the so-called long wheelbase, yes. The engine is the very classic V12 3-liter Colombo based engine. It created Ferrari's myth, and the 250 GT is the most successful Ferrari engine.
And why was it called the Boano? Because most people have heard of Pininfarina, but not Boano.
There was a time when Pininfarina didn't have the capacity to build all the various bodies. And there was Mario Boano, later on Ezio Elena, and so they got the job to construct these bodies for a small batch of cars.
The design was therefore Pininfarina's design?
Yes, of course, it all was based on the Pininfarina design, that's correct. There are small variations. There is, for example, the very first cars had a little hump here.
Okay.
And this was straightened out.
Just behind the door?
Yeah, right here was a little hump.
Marcel, of the, let's say, 70 odd examples of this 250 Boano model that were built, were all of those 70 cars identical, or were there some variations?
Absolutely not. There were a number of variations. There's even a very flamboyant one of Boano that is in long-term ownership in Germany. This particular car might also have been hand-built with differences in the length of the door between the right side and the left side.
Because they were all hand-built?
They were all hand-built, and there is a wonderful story that the customer asked Enzo Ferrari and said, "Mr. Ferrari, Commendatore, why is the driver's door 75 centimeters long and the passenger door is 78 centimeters long?" The answer from Commendatore Enzo Ferrari was, "Well, nobody cares because you will never see both at the same time." I like that sort of answer. This is typical Commendatore Enzo Ferrari. This is very Italian, this is very Modenese. It explains a lot.
It's like the old saying that I sell you the engine and the rest of the car I'm giving you for free.
Well, Ferrari was very famous for the engine, of course. The chassis was a little less sophisticated sometimes, but the engine was the key, 100%. And the body to the taste of the buyer. You could go to all the various coach builders. You could go to Pininfarina, Touring, Ghia, Bertone, you name it, Boano, whoever.
And by the time that this car was built, is it right to say that Pininfarina had pretty much become the coach builder, the carrozzeria of choice for Ferrari?
That's correct, because after 1955, when Vignale stopped bodying Ferrari chassis, it was basically just Pininfarina. It was a matter of capacity for some times, but we must not forget Pininfarina in those years was already much more industrialized, much more professional, bigger than most of the other smaller coach builders.
So they had the capacity, apart from a period when they gave it to
Boano and later
to build cars on the scale that Ferrari was then starting to require because of its success.
Yes, yes. We must not forget, in the very first years, Ferrari built like 20, 25 cars per year. And by 1957, it was around 300 cars, roughly, which is a super small number, if you consider that. I mean,
well, compared to today, what do they build now?
Well, 10,000. Yeah,
10,
it's still a small number.
10,000 now, and how many did you say? About
300. And if you compare that with Porsche, for example, they make 250,000 cars per year. So Porsche is nothing really scarce. Ferrari with 10,000 today is still something very exclusive.
But with between 100 and 300 a year, it makes even the Ferraris of today seem positively common, doesn't it?
That's true.
What would the typical use of one of these cars been in the day? We know that the Tour de France is a similar chassis, engine, but slightly different bodywork, which I guess is a gentleman racer's car.
Yes, yes, there were
weekend racers and some professional racers as well.
Some very professional race drivers as well. Yes.
So if a professional racing driver bought a Tour de France, what does somebody buy this car for?
Maybe more the sort of a weekend racer, but still a person that was very ambitious, that wanted something sporty, that wanted to be sure that he could win, be it a rally or a smaller event, maybe even a hill climb in Italy or in France or in Spain. Certainly not necessarily the Targa Florio or the Sebring 12 hours or the Daytona 24 hours, but for the smaller events, a Boano was a good tool.
And what sort of performance would this car have had?
Well, if we look at the Ferrari paperwork, like the Foglio di Montaggio, they usually reveal on the dyno test sheet the real truth. But officially, if you look into the sales brochure, it was quite ambitious. They said between 200 and 240 horsepower. Maybe it was 212 or 217 on the dyno. Yeah. But that was okay.
Everybody else was doing the same thing anyway, wasn't it?
Exactly. It's all about marketing and selling.
A bit of poetic license.
Yes.
And in terms of speed, a car like this would, and I know it's what I would have wanted to know as a kid, what will it do, mister?
Well, I guess we should not forget that traffic in those years was not as heavy as we have today. So you had a little more freedom.
So the brakes weren't as good?
Braking was not the key, actually. Brakes were
Going
sometimes
was more important.
a little, yeah, exactly. I would say like 240, maybe 230 kilometers an hour.
Yeah, so about 130 miles an hour or thereabouts.
Roughly, yeah, maybe 140 miles.
Which is pretty good, I suppose, if you consider that a Fiat Topolino or a Fiat Cinquecento of the time.
As long as you have an open road with no other traffic.
Yeah.
And please make it that happening in Texas with a wide road, nobody else around you, and you have plenty of room to try to brake.
But they had the first autostradas in Italy, I guess, round about then, didn't they?
That's right. Late 50s.
Yeah.
Correct.
Let's take a look at this car in the detail. Imagine that I'm not here. Somebody has asked you to take a look at a car that they're interested in buying.
Okay.
And I am looking over the shoulder of great expert Marcel Massini, and you just happen to have the habit of talking to yourself as you're doing this, so that I know what your reasoning is. I pretend that I'm not here and discover the car.
Before I even walk into the warehouse and have a look at the car, naturally I prepare myself. Thanks to my archive, which I've built up over all these years, I am usually pretty well documented. I try to arrive with all the information that I already have gathered, including the chronological history, who was the first owner, what was the intention of the owner, what were, if known, the original colors, of course all the various numbers. I want to check first the chassis number, I want to check the engine number, I want to make sure that the internal engine block number is matching with the build sheets.
Right, because there are two numbers on the engine.
There's two numbers on the engine, that's right. I do check carburetor type, carburetor numbers. I do check the data tag on the firewall. Is it still the original one? Has it been replaced? I do check the gearbox number. I have to remove the gearbox tunnel to do that.
Right.
I do check the rear axle number. That also has the stamping of the ratio like 7/32 or whatever it is. And all these things. I check the date stamped on the steering box, because that will tell me if the steering box is still the original one to that car. If it's a later dated steering box, it can be assumed that the car was in a crash, and therefore the steering box was replaced with a later model. So all these things give me already a good indication how good is the car in terms of numbers, matching numbers, etc. If you have a non-matching engined Ferrari, it means you have 20% less value, automatically, at least.
What about the other numbers? So let's say the engine number,
yes,
which is effectively the same as the chassis number, I think.
For these cars, yes. Up until
later cars,
yes.
not. So that's the most important number, that the fact that the engine number is the same as the chassis number. If not, it's a 20% hit to value.
Yeah, that is key for sure.
Other numbers that are important? Nothing is as important as that, I don't think, is it?
We can, on certain cars, I look for the body number, especially on Pininfarina bodied cars, also on Vignale bodied cars, but also on touring bodied Ferraris.
Would you find it on a car like this?
Not on a Boano.
Okay.
No, unfortunately not on a Boano. But this is also key because it tells me has perhaps part of the body, or worst case, the entire body, been replaced. We don't know.
Yeah.
Some of these cars were raced quite hard and had maybe a crash, so they received maybe a new front clip, or the entire body was new. So these are all indications for originality, or maybe a little less.
And there was a fashion, wasn't there, for replacing bodywork in the 70s and 80s to make cars perfect.
That's number one.
Which
and
people don't do anymore, or try not to anyway.
Number one, also some of these cars, unfortunately, and that's why they are so rare today, have been cannibalized and used as a donor car for, especially in the case of a Boano, for a 250 GTO replica or a 250 Testarossa replica, something like that, or a short wheelbase California or long wheelbase California Spider replica. So these cars today are quite rare. I would think that probably only half of the numbers built still exist today.
That few?
There was a time when these cars were relatively cheap, and a California Spider, even if it was a replica, was relatively valuable. So people just chopped them up and used.
So in the sort of 70s and early 80s?
Late 70s, early 80s, yeah, it was quite fashionable. There were certain countries that had a number of so-called restorers.
Without mentioning England and Italy?
I didn't say that. I didn't mention any country. I was just thinking about certain countries. Okay, yeah, but there was a real replica industry in those years. Also in northern Italy, and of course nowadays this is absolutely forbidden. It shouldn't. It would be a sacrilege to cut a car like this and make it into a GTO Series 1 or whatever. That would be terrible.
Well, I guess that's a result of the value of these cars coming up.
Fortunately.
And also the fact that the factory, the Ferrari factory, for example, has taken a tough stance against replicas and heavily modified cars, which has removed really the financial incentive to cannibalize original cars to make replicas.
It's very, very good that this system was introduced. I admire Ferrari Classica for doing this. It has taken a few years to come to a certain point where they have reached a level where we can really say, okay, now they're doing a really good job. This is great. Everybody's learning. We must not forget these cars were built like 65 years ago. The people that built these cars, they are no longer around. Most of them have long passed away, unfortunately. So we can only rely on few original cars like this, old photographs, old documents, journalists, articles in car magazines, etc. Movies, perhaps. Sometimes we find old movies, YouTube, wherever, where we see these cars racing, where we can hopefully see some details. So we basically rely on archive material.
That brings, I think, forward an interesting point. You mentioned that cars like this are now one of the few reference points for how they were originally. Do you therefore think that a car like this, and when I say like this, I mean in this condition, this sort of survivor condition, should it be used or should it be preserved in a museum? Because if it's used, and let's say it's crashed on the Mille Miglia and you smash the whole front of the car, it happens, unfortunately.
It can happen.
What if there isn't another car in this condition to refer to? It's gone forever, or at least that amount of originality is gone forever.
I agree with that. It's certainly the risk, but I think as long as you sit in a car, start the engine and drive away, there is always a little risk. These cars were not built to be a static display in a living room or on a pedestal in a museum. I think these cars should be driven, but naturally with a certain caution and
some respect.
A lot of respect,
yeah.
Yes.
But I think it's easier to drive a fully restored car, which most of them are, but perhaps restored multiple times, and to drive it fast, whereas something that is a survivor, a little bit like the Daytona Spider that has, 100 miles from new, you know the car I'm referring to. I'm a great believer in driving things as well, but if you owned that, you almost wouldn't drive it. You've looked through your files before you come and see a car.
Yes.
You've looked through the build records, you've looked through the Italian registration records, if it was an Italian car, of course. You've
old photos.
Gone through old photos. So before you get to the location where you're going to see a car, you have a pretty good idea of what you're going to see, don't you? You know what you'd like to see,
yes.
I guess.
Of course, it's all about due diligence. I try to find out as much as I can before I even jump in a plane. The more you know, the better you are prepared. It helps you much more. You can save time, and you have more time to look at the car in great details. And preparation is everything. And being a Swiss, I think it's only normal.
You've arrived. Let me melt into the background and take over again where you left off. What are the first things you're going to look at?
The first thing is the overall impression when I walk into the room. How does the car appeal to me? Is it completely new to me? Do I have a good feeling? Or maybe I'm a little frustrated or disappointed? Normally I'm very enthusiastic about these cars.
First impression.
First impression is most important. It's cool. It's not red. It's old. It may smell. And it shows a certain age, and it has some patina. This is super important. All of us have seen so many restored cars, I would say restored to death, which is horrible. I don't like that. So a car like this automatically is more fascinating because I have to think back, how was life in 1957 when these cars were built and they were raced? They were just a tool. And as you said before, nobody thought that 50, 60 years later, we would be here and looking at the same car. The car would still exist. A normal car from 1957 is long gone and on the scrapyard in bits and pieces. Fortunately, not this Boano.
So as you walk around the car, I want to share Marcel Massini's stream of consciousness. What does it say to you? What details do you like? Maybe some details you don't like?
I have to say, on this particular car, there is not a single detail that I don't like, except that I would maybe take off a few of the stickers, because they are not from 1957, but that's a small detail. Overall, this is a fabulous car because it's exactly how life was in 57. And by the way, I was born in 57, so that automatically appeals to me.
It's a good
more.
vintage.
Yeah. Yeah, it is my vintage. I naturally open the hood, I look at the chassis number, I look at the engine number, I look at the carburetors, I look at all the various components, the fuel pump, etc., etc. I do a lot of photographs, which later on, when I'm back in my office, I blow up to the biggest possible scale and resolution and verify everything again, because normally nowadays a camera sees more than your human eyes. It's amazing the quality of cameras that we have today. And I check all the various details, even the wiper, the stamping on the wiper. I look at the interior mirror. I look at the door, the key lock numbers. I look at the tail lights. Is it really the old original Carello, or is it maybe a replacement? Might be from a different car, from an Alfa Romeo or from a Lancia. I look at the license plate illumination pieces. I look, of course, I check the various chroming and how does the paint look. Has it not been repainted? Maybe you can tell or you can't.
Right.
I naturally look at the various stampings and engravings on the glass. Is it the original Securit glass, or has it been replaced? Does it have the right date code?
Okay.
That's very important. You can tell if it has been replaced or not, also on the younger cars, of course.
Is this, in your opinion,
This
the
is correct.
original glass?
This is correct. If you look here, you see the date, 3rd of November 1955.
Okay.
How cool is that? This is an original glass from 1955, which they installed in 1956.
So that's lasted 61 years, that windscreen.
That's correct.
That's remarkable.
Yes. I look, of course, at the headlights. Is it the correct type? Yes, of course. It's the proper number. It's the Marshall with the right number. Same for the fog light, of course.
Yeah.
Sometimes the car has a too modern, later Ferrari badge, the famous yellow badge.
Right.
People tend to replace these, or maybe it was stolen at the moment and somebody replaced it. A rear view mirror is not so important because this is an item that can easily be replaced.
Okay.
I do like and check the Boano stamping on the wheels, on the rims.
Yep.
Has to be correct. On certain cars there is a date code inside the rim. For example, it says 455, like April 1955. Then, of course, I look at the interior. And
So
here,
Boano date stamped the wheels in some cases.
yes, especially on the race cars.
Right.
I look at the instruments. Are these the original instruments? Maybe they have been replaced, or somebody has added a clock or an altimeter or some other special unit, or placed on the gearbox tunnel. I look at the heater. On this particular car, we have a Marrone painted heater, and I'm pretty sure that this Marrone heater is the original heater that matches with the original color of the car, because this car used to be Marrone before it was painted green right after the car was delivered. I assume that the original owner, Mr. Lucien Bonnet, the original driver, had the car repainted right from the beginning.
Because when it rallied, I think we've seen the color pictures, haven't we?
Yes.
Early in '58, it was already
green.
painted this color.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. But I have found traces of the old original paint, the Marrone color, in the trunk lid on the right side, and also I think in the little tunnel that goes around for the bonnet.
So that's a tricky dilemma. If the car was painted by the first owner, or at least the original driver who raced it, in this color, but had left Modena in brown, and we both like originality, which is correct?
Well, number one, if we find proof that the car was repainted right at the beginning, meaning in the first couple of weeks or months, I don't think this is a big dilemma, because this is a period correct color that existed back in '57 already. Naturally, if it were repainted 10 years later, that's a different story.
Out of period.
Out of period,
Yeah.
okay. The other thing that might help is, if we don't know what really was the original color, either we can try to check with the Ferrari factory and the Classica department. They might have copies of the old commercial sheet for each car was, besides the folio di montaggio, was also a commercial sheet where it specified what was the original color, or we may find a copy of the delivery note, or maybe an order sheet. How did the first guy that ordered this car, how did he wanted to have his car built, in which colors, in which specifications? Same for the interior, the leather, which was in those years supplied by a Swiss company named Arbo Tan. Now this grigio is a typical grigio from the days. I'm 100% sure that this is the old original grigio Arbo leather.
With fabric in the center.
Yes, yes, this was typical. It was also a question of money, price, of course, in those days.
Even on a Ferrari.
Even on a Ferrari. And there have been many Ferraris, and we know that from the Ferrari Dinos from the 60s. A number of these Dinos had the so-called vinyl door panels, and not the genuine, more expensive Connolly leather you're used to.
So this predated Connolly, did it?
Yeah,
in
absolutely.
terms of supplying Ferrari, at least.
There were there were a number of leather manufacturers and suppliers at the time. There was Arbo in the 50s. Then we had, of course, Connolly for many years, but there was also Franzi.
Yes,
Franzi was also an Italian leather manufacturer and supplier. Each car had its individual leather supplier.
Okay. So do I assume, therefore, that in your opinion, the car should be left in this color because it was painted this color immediately after delivery and
yes,
did its racing career in this color?
Absolutely. Because of that, I would absolutely leave it in that color. And I have to say, this green, in my opinion, suits a Boano very well. The same car in a regular red would look horrible.
It's too elegant and too understated.
It's super elegant. It's super elegant. Imagine, whenever, I get these calls from people all the time. They say, oh, Mr. Massini, I would like to buy a car. I have a budget of, let's say, $2 million. What should I buy? My first answer usually is, what is your intention? What do you want to do? You want to do the Mille Miglia with it? Do you want to do a Concours d'Elegance? You plan to win in Pebble Beach? You want to just enjoy it with your girlfriend during the weekend? What do you want to do with it? And then think about, how was life in the late 50s? Oh, I want to buy a 250 GT. Okay, 250 GT can be anything from an early 250 GT Europa to a Boano, to a Tour de France, to a shuttle base, even to a GTO. So tell me what you want to do, and then try to imagine how was life in 1957. Maybe the guy today that wants to buy it wasn't even born in 1957. So I want these people to first think what they are going to buy has to fit their dreams, of course. But
their lifestyle.
Their lifestyle as well. But if they buy an old classic car, they must imagine, or I hope they do imagine, and they try to think, how was life in the late 50s? It was totally different than in 2021.
Sure. It's a time machine.
It is an absolutely time machine.
Looking at the paint on this car, do you think that the paint dates from 58? Do you think it's been repainted since then?
I don't think it has been repainted since the late 50s, not at all. It's quite thin in certain areas. Of course, you can do a lot if you clean it up a little bit, if you detail it, but the question is always how far do you want to go? I think the way it is now is fantastic.
Marcel, should we have a look inside at the
Yes,
cabin?
please.
And you can just talk us through anything that you think is particularly unusual or special. And
Well,
we'll have a look under the bonnet and the engine bay.
Of course, the leather is cracked, and but this is actually good because we can tell the car has been used. This is all genuine, original, old Arbo-Tan leather. It must be the original one. Yes, of course. Here it's a little broken. It's normal for a car of that age. Also, the panel here has some water damage. Naturally, this car was also driven in the rain, and of course there must have been some water that came into the door, but that's not a big deal. It's part of the patina. I like that.
Okay.
I also look at the headliner. The headliner is super genuine. I love that quality material.
It's wool, isn't it?
It's wool, 100%. The little handle for the passenger And the sun visors, of course, in the typical color, like sort of a brownish glass or plexiglass.
Those are great.
And then naturally the rear view mirror, very small and tiny, and
it's almost like a pre-war car, that rear
yeah,
view
very
mirror, with
much
the
so.
beveled edges to the glass.
That's correct. In those days, the mirror was no longer mounted on the dash, it was hanging from the roof.
Yep.
Then we have a little ashtray on top of the dashboard.
Because we know that all Ferrari racing drivers, of course, smoked.
It was a normal habit in those years, yes. We have the little lights here on the sides, on both sides, that
Yep.
illuminate the cockpit, the interior.
With this great sort of Bakelite moldings.
Very Bakelite, super, I love it, that material. We see the leather straps for the luggage. Maybe
Yep.
this car came with a wonderful little trunk or a little valise that was put in here. Of course, there was a trunk, but when the lady came with you, you needed
You had a bit more luggage.
A little bit more luggage. If it was a Louis Vuitton, we don't know. Then we have a fantastic, genuine wooden steering wheel, which has perfect little grips on the back, so you can really hold it. It looks very thin, but it really is very good to drive a car of this age. I've recently driven a 250 Lusso, which had a similar steering wheel, and I really enjoyed driving that car with this kind of steering wheel for a whole day.
And Nardi in Italy made the steering wheels
That's
for all
correct.
Ferraris by this period, didn't
In those years, yes, it was Nardi that was the supplier.
they? Yep.
Then, of course, we see the pedals, we see the carpeting that also covers the gearbox tunnel. The heater I already mentioned is in the original color. It's a IPRA heater. It's very easy to open it up on each side to blow air out if
It's
needed.
very primitive.
It is quite primitive, but it seems to work.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, yeah. Then, of course, I want to have a look at the inside of the engine compartment.
The
So
heart of the
heart of
the
it
beast.
all. So here we go. Yes, thank you. We have the classic V12 3-liter 250 GT engine. The first thing I check, of course, is that data plate still here? Is it the old original plate? How is it attached? On some cars it has been removed and reattached. Sometimes they do fake tags with wrong fonts and wrong stamping, so I check those numbers. Do they match with the chassis number, which is down here on the left front main tube? 0645 GT it says, that's wonderful.
Yep.
On the other side, where you are standing, I will then check the engine number.
Yep.
I hope it 0645, and then right on the left side of that raised boss, you can find the internal engine block number.
Yeah.
Here on the left side, we have the steering box, which has a date stamped here, and it has also a number for the steering box. As I explained earlier, if that date is much later than when this car was built, it's a clear sign that the steering box has been replaced, and normally that happens when a car had front damage, so they had to replace the steering box.
Okay.
We have the carburetors, naturally the typical Weber carburetors.
Triple carburetors. With this big air filter on top.
Exactly, the FISPA filter, and we have a horn. Fiat Marshall horn, yes, correct. We have the bottles here that oftentimes get lost or are being replaced by some poor copies.
Yep.
FISPA, exactly. The radiator is something that often gets damaged or is just too old and has been replaced with a wrong radiator.
Is that the correct one?
That is the correct one. I naturally check out the tag here. Is it good and original? Sometimes it has been fixed. I check the little cap here, if that's right.
Anything under here that looks out of place to you?
Not to me, it looks very, very genuine. Even the little numbering dots here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., are still here on the cap, which is good. This, of course, has been replaced, I'm sure.
The leads,
the cables,
the plug leads.
yes. But this is normal for a car of this age.
Yeah.
But overall, this is all genuine and very original. I see the little quilting and the mat inside the hood here.
Yeah.
On some cars, this has been removed and is without any pad.
Right.
What
do you think of that? Is that all correct?
In my opinion, this is very correct. Maybe this has been replaced over the years, but it has to have this sort of
this diamond
quilted.
pattern.
Yes, 100%.
Right. Okay.
Then on some cars, especially on a Pininfarina bodied car, you can find here on a little tag a body number sometimes.
Okay.
Let's say we talk about the 250 GT Pininfarina Coupe. This is where you can find the body number, or also sometimes in the center here where the lock is. To look for body numbers, they might be stamped there.
Okay.
So overall, I'm very happy with this engine compartment. Again, this is not about the mechanical condition of the car. This is about originality here. Okay? So before you drive this car, it would be very good to have it properly refurbished and overhauled to make sure that everything works. The engine is good, doesn't lose oil, that you have fully working brakes and all that stuff.
That it's safe and reliable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Again, we talk about a good old lady here. We don't talk about the 2021 brand new Ferrari, where we can apply totally different standards.
Yeah. And I guess probably the last place to have a look, I guess.
The trunk.
Or the boot as we Brits say.
Yes, of course. We see the spare wheel, the Boano, which is painted inside, which is all good. We have the Boano stamping here, the Boano record, the size of the wheel. And then I also check if there is the actual number, the RW number 3264, which is the correct rim size for a 250 Boano.
Okay.
And then, of course...
That's 16 inches?
Yes. 16 by 5.5 here.
Yep.
And we have an old Michelin. We have the gas filler cap, and fortunately with the old original cap to close it, this often gets lost.
Still in place.
Yes.
And the spare wheel takes up half the boot, so it's no wonder that they have a large shelf behind the seats for the rest of the luggage.
That is true.
Yeah, and a big fuel tank.
Yeah, well, you need a lot of gas. These cars can easily drink 30 liters by 400 kilometers, depending on your driving style.
Yes, especially if you drive them like you would on the Monte Carlo Rally.
Yeah. What I find interesting on this particular car is that I found in certain areas, I found traces of the very original color, the maroon.
Oh yeah.
And it's right down here where you can see some remnants of the original color marron.
It's sort of marron, brown, isn't it?
Yeah, sort
it's
of
like a very dark red wine.
Correct, and I also found this in the little valley of the engine compartment opening.
Okay.
There's certain areas where you can see the marron color. I think it's on the right and on the left side. Okay.
Okay, interesting. What's the Massini unfiltered opinion?
I like this car because it's a very genuine and authentic, unrestored, unmolested, untouched 250 GT Boano Coupe. Naturally, I'm a little biased because this car was built in '57, the same year when I was built. And I love the color because it reminds me of the good old days, the late 50s. These cars were not red. They had fantastic colors. They had a lot of taste, the people that bought these cars. Wealthy industrialists and businessmen and some very prominent people that used to race these cars. And just imagine how was life back then in 1957 when these cars were born.
And if this car was in your garage today, what would you want, if anything, but what would you want to do to it? Is there anything that you would improve, change, modify, restore, anything at all?
I would not modify it, I would not restore it, I would just make absolutely sure that mechanically everything is good and that you're safe when you want to drive it. I would certainly go to a couple shows where they have a special preservation class, because this is the perfect candidate for a concours d'elegance having a preservation class. There are so many cars that have been restored over the years, and there's very few left that are still untouched, unrestored, dans son jus in French, but it looks really nice, and it has a wonderful patina. I like that.
Marcel Massini, Ferrari expert, thank you for the masterclass.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for showing me the car. I would love to buy it. It would fit very nicely to
As
my
auctioneers
green,
say,
more modern car.
come and see me later.
I like
Thanks,
that
Marcel.
too. It's a pleasure.